Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Joseph Hayat, standing in for Gayatri.
The world has been transfixed by the tsunami of violence unleashed over the last few weeks in the tiny Gaza Strip, where almost 2 million people are trapped in one of the most densely populated places in the world.
Gaza, long under siege, is now utterly invaded. Thousands of people, most of them civilians, many of them women and children, have been slain or maimed. Hospitals are collapsing, literally under shell fire. UN schools, 6 of them have been bombarded from land, sea and air, with the loss of scores of children.
Little noticed in this blizzard of shot and shell has been the equally disastrous contemporaneous collapse of Libya. The state appears to have disintegrated, warring militias laying waste to the country, oil tankers on fire in the capital, the death toll incalculable to date. And it's getting worse. Helping us make a sense of it all is leading journalist Hafsa Kara Mustafa, who's reported and analysed for most of the world's top outfits in recent years. Hafsa, let's start with Gaza. What would have to happen for the world to tell Israel to stop? After all, 6 United Nations schools have now been bombarded. Scores, maybe hundreds, of children have been killed and maimed in those schools. The UN Secretary General has said there can be nothing more shameful than killing sleeping children. The United Nations top official in Gaza is weeping on camera. Governments all over the world are lamely calling for a ceasefire. Israel is bulldozing on regardless. What's going to happen?
Nothing. Because Israel is never punished for anything it does. It actually has the green light, in fact, from the international community to continue doing what it's doing. It's had a pat on the back from all the leading international leaders, and therefore it feels it can continue shamelessly, despite all the images, despite all the devastation that we're witnessing. So really, as long as there's absolutely no pressure from any of the leading, supposedly democracies of the world, then there's no reason for Israel to stop. It will continue. It has in its sight the extermination of the Palestinian people, and it's doing it with total impunity.
Well, I'll come back to that point in a minute, but within 3 hours of Obama making the strongest condemnation of the massacre in the UN school, he agreed to resupply Israel with the very ammunition which had just destroyed the UN school. What's the US double face on this?
I mean, this is when the word chutzpah comes into place, because this is utterly ridiculous and shameful. I don't know. I'm running out of adjectives to really describe the policy of America at the moment.
But the BBC, when I was on my way in here for this interview, is still repeating the utterly absurd adage that this operation is to destroy tunnels.
The worst aspect of the BBC reporting is that the more criticism it's faced, and there have been protests outside the HQ, and still it's going along that line, which is to actually show the Israeli line of thinking that they're doing this in reaction to Hamas. There is almost no explanation that whatever Hamas is doing, and it's almost farcical what they're doing, it's in reaction to the occupation and the devastation and the suffering of the Palestinian people for the past 7 years. Now, this idea of tunnels is again the joke of the story. We know that Israel boasts some of the most sophisticated weaponry and technology across the region and in fact in the world. So they had all the capabilities to know and to pinpoint these tunnels ages ago without actually having to go in and shell and flatten the entire Gaza. So this is just another excuse for Israel to continue.
Now, tell us, moving to the Maghreb, about the situation in Libya. I mentioned in the introduction that whilst all this is happening, and of course big conflicts in the Ukraine and other big international stories, Libya is falling apart. How and why?
falling apart is almost, I mean, now it's a given. We would be tempted to say that Libya is in the midst of a civil war, but that was almost 6 months after the ousting of Gaddafi. Libya is today a failed state. It's run by warring militias. It's been heavily armed during the so-called revolution, which was ultimately a regime change operation led by NATO. Qatar provided and inundated Libya with arms. What happens today, Libya is made up of essentially a very youthful population. The majority of people are under the age of 30, heavily armed, all which have no wish to run a well-structured country. They're just running riot, and each to their own. And it's a failed state. It's the new Somalia of Africa.
What are these militias fighting about? It's not even regional, is it? It's not like the east and the west of the country are fighting to separate themselves off from Libya. That would at least have some logic, however bizarre and reprehensible. But it's just militias fighting for power, isn't it, and wealth.
I mean, just to come back on one thing, had we not had the example of Iraq in 2003, we could at least be surprised. But we now know for a fact that supposedly bombing countries into democracy doesn't work. So what is happening today was entirely predictable from day one. The minute Western nations, led by David Cameron and Sarkozy, went to the UN for supposedly a no-fly zone, which turned into regime change.
Turned into a plenty-fly zone.
We knew very well that this would happen. This is what happened when you bomb a country, when there is a power vacuum, and especially a country that was held together really very much by Gaddafi and by his sort of sense of keeping the tribal areas in check. This was inevitable. What the warring militias are fighting about is everything and nothing. They're just heavily armed kids running riot. And on top of the arms that were supplied by Qatar, we also have the arsenal, the national arsenal that was accumulated for 40 years by Gaddafi, that is now in the hands of all sorts of warring militias and terror groups that are running riot across Libya and also across the Sahel belt.
Is it going to spill over? I'm asking myself, why should it be isolated to Libya? There must be a message going out to other potential so-called jihadis that if you can get your hands on the hardware and get yourself a foreign patron, you could actually carve yourself out a bit of power and wealth.
And it's happened already. It happened in Mali when there was the overtake of by Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb in the Azawad region. That was a direct consequence of the arms that were flowing in from Libya. You know, at the time, under Gaddafi, that region, which was slightly in turmoil, there were, you know, aspirations of independence from certain parts, were kept in check. But with the influx of arms flooding into the region, loads of various different terror groups got hold of arms and did what they did. And the hostage-taking in Algeria, in the Gaspard of Algeria, last January 2013, was very much a consequence of that. Here we had a group that barely had any arms, suddenly found themselves possessing the most sophisticated weaponry that just flooded in, and hence we saw the major hostage crisis in Algeria.
And obviously, what does seem to be happening in the background is I've had a lot of Qatari real estate companies and all the arms of the developing Qatari nation with its wealth are somehow getting in behind the scenes into Libya, and there seems to be a lot of land and areas being occupied almost secretly, awaiting the outcome of this conflict.
I think that was the original idea very early on, but because the situation disintegrated almost immediately, and I think they've just taken a step back. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they funded this. It was almost a joke to them. There was a personal animosity between the Sheikh of Qatar and Gaddafi. He got his own back on Gaddafi, and we saw the ignominious death of the leader, of the Libyan leader. So he got his back. He got his back on Gaddafi, and now really it's irrelevant what they've invested. They've invested in war. They've had their war, and now the rest is on hold.
And they've lost it now. I mean, whatever. If their idea was an investment, it's one that's gone bad. It would have to be written off in accountancy terms. Oil production in Libya is now a fraction of its capacity. As I said in the introduction, the oil storage tanks are actually on fire right now in Tripoli, the capital. And the country doesn't look like it's going to be governable in the next 30 years. So they'd have to wait a long time for a return on that investment.
I don't think their main objective was in any way investment anyway. But just touching back on the oil companies make a profit either way. You know, if the output is reduced, then the price goes up on the international market.
Good point.
If there's more output, then they're selling more because other countries that don't produce stock up when the prices go down. So either way, the oil companies make a killing out of this story. You know, ultimately it's Libya that's lost and the Libyan people who've lost out. That's really it.
But there can be virtually no foreign presence now in Libya. All the embassies have closed except the British and the Italian. I'm not sure why they're continuing, but everyone else has gone. It's not safe for anyone. The airport is inoperable, indeed is one of the major sites of the fighting, so no one can fly in or out. The US ambassador was murdered by the very people the United States put in power, the Al-Qaeda elements in Benghazi. Is anybody making any money out of Libya?
Absolutely. The security companies that are going to come in. I mean, as I said, the parallel with Iraq is very obvious. And there are two major sectors that have thrived in the invasion of Iraq, the security companies and the oil companies. Now, you know, move over to Libya, and in order to ensure the output, future output of oil, then that's going to come into the hands of these major security companies that are incredibly successul and make all their money from chaos, essentially in the Arab world and of course in Africa. And Libya is Arab and African, so it really is their ultimate goal and their ultimate dream.
Well, I mean, as NATO success stories go, Libya has to be the nadir, at least so far. Hafsa, you're a star. We'll have you back on the Sputnik before long. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the state of human rights throughout the Middle East and the different approach Western governments and media take to case studies like, say, Syria and Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. It seems almost fanciful indulgence to be discussing human rights in today's Middle East, where an entire people's very existence is under threat, where dictatorship, usually Western-backed, has its boot on the throat of almost all of their people.
But that, in a way, is precisely why we must discuss it. After all, it is the so-called moral authority of democracy, the rule of law and human rights which Western countries perpetually draw upon when justifying their policies towards the rest of the world, which often includes invading and occupying it.
Rory Donaghy is a journalist who has a long track record of working in the region on subjects as diverse as the United Arab Emirates and all the way to Gaza and beyond. And I'm glad to say Rory joins us now. Now let's start at the Gulf, if we may. You and I both have our difficulties with some of the governments there. In your case, because you cast a critical eye, an objective, journalistic and analytical eye on one of the governments in the Gulf. This is par for the course, isn't it? If you look too closely into the Arab Gulf dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, well, you probably won't get back in.
Yeah, I think the Gulf monarchies have a long history of not tolerating any dissent, whether it's from their own citizens or external voices. And a large part of this is through the fact they don't want to open up a political space to allow people to be involved in the governance process. That's the history of monarchy, really, not just in the Gulf, but elsewhere. And there's very little to say that there's been any opening up in the Gulf states, although cities like Abu Dhabi and Dubai now enjoy global appeal. It's superficial, I think.
Yes, and of course the West is best friends with these monarchies. For all the talk of the need for human rights and the rule of law in a place like Syria, for example, the West seems to have very few difficulties dealing with the most authoritarian regimes in the Gulf. Is that all just about money?
I think that it's very difficult to view what the West does in the Middle East and the Gulf on a principled level. They clearly use language that suits their needs, whenever that may be, if it's human rights discourse or it's stability or it's anything they choose to get what they want. And more often than not, obviously, securing these interests involves oil contracts and arms deals and the such. stability only matters when the interests are being met in the West, and so that discourse can be quickly abandoned for something else when they feel that there's a chance to further their interests, or if someone is maybe not quite playing ball when it comes to securing those contracts, money, whatever it may be. So I think that you can view any language used in the West by politicians as disposable. And it's very rarely, if ever, used on a principled level. I don't think this can be.
Tell me about Bahrain. This is one of the longest-running revolutions in the current Middle East. As a proportion of their tiny population, a very large number of people have been killed, wounded, tortured, imprisoned. Yet that never makes it onto the news, either in the Arab world or in the West. Why?
I think that a lot of people would say that it's got something to do with the US basing their Fifth Fleet on a strategically important island in between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's certainly the case, I think, in terms of the American policy. With Britain has a long history, of course, with Bahrain and continues to be its closest friend. We have a vested interest and very long, close relationship with the Sunni monarchy. And this flies in the face of a Shia majority who have been revolting now since February 2011 and appear no closer to achieving their goal. And in large part, I think that is down to the diplomatic support provided by Bahrain's allies, principally the UK and America.
And of course, across the causeway, Saudi Arabia. What's the current scorecard of human rights in our very best friend in the region?
I think Saudi Arabia has one of the most deplorable human rights records, not only in the region, if not the world. I mean, their toleration of dissent is really concerning. Their new terrorism laws this year have been used to prosecute human rights lawyers, and they tolerate very little open debate in Saudi Arabia. And obviously it goes beyond that to being the only country in the world that doesn't allow women to drive. And it also meddles in other places as well, including Bahrain, where obviously they sent in the troops in 2011 to break up protests at the Pearl Roundabout, which resulted in scores of deaths among protesters.
But aside from the politics, what about the human rights of individuals and the citizens across this region? I mean, there was a story this week I read of, a Saudi Arabian man being sentenced to 3 years and 450 lashes for meeting men through Twitter. You hear heinous things that happen to these individuals. What about their personal rights, their human rights?
Well, they don't have any in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where obviously homosexuality is not tolerated. In a country where you don't tolerate any criticism, they're not likely to be very open on their sexuality laws.
But why is there no fuss about this? Why aren't there campaigns, boycott demands and so on? Where are the pink campaigners who are always after Russia, for example, where no such thing could ever happen?
I think the people who campaign on gay rights are likely trying to make this cause, but it doesn't get into the mainstream discourse because of our very close ties with Saudi Arabia.
Now, no tour de horizon of human rights would be complete without talking about Palestine, which is the country existentially threatened, its very existence. The people, country long ago was wiped off the map, but the people are actually threatened now, especially in Gaza. What's, though, the situation in the West Bank, where you have ostensibly a Palestinian Authority? How are they doing on human rights?
Well, not very well. And I think that in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority in recent weeks, when there's been mass protests from Nablus to Ramallah and Hebron, they've been involved in shooting at protesters themselves, and a lot of Palestinians certainly view the authority as being acting on Israel and America's behalf, perhaps because of the funding and perhaps because of the actions that they've done. Scores of Palestinians have died in the West Bank in recent weeks since the Gaza offensive started, killed not only by Israelis but also with the willing complicity of the Palestinian Authority. Abbas is running around the region seemingly in a desperate fashion to try and reclaim some relevance in all of this. And I think also it has to be said that following the 2006 free and fair election in the Palestinian Authority, Hamas won and only were able to take power in Gaza forcibly from Fatah. So the Palestinian Authority certainly don't have a mandate in terms of representing the Palestinian people. And I think it's an urgent need for elections to be held so people can voice their concerns.
Well, to paraphrase Henry Kissinger, which is the first time I've ever done that, it's a pity they both can't lose. Hamas and Fatah have both seen their support fall markedly. Ironically, this Israeli invasion of Gaza, which is allowing the Palestinian resistance to get to grips face to face on the ground and taking quite a toll actually on the invading forces, it's probably done Hamas quite a bit of good electorally.
Yeah, I think that if you just look at the protests in the West Bank, there have been green Hamas flags flying in nearly all of them and in quite high numbers. And within Gaza itself, prior to this, as you rightly said, support for Hamas had fallen quite dramatically. They weren't governing very well. The people weren't, their lives was appalling. It's not necessarily just Hamas's fault. I mean, the 8-year-long siege is obviously changing things there. But this offensive certainly has markedly increased the support for Hamas. Whether this lasts for the long term is obviously unclear.
The catastrophe that's now unfolding in Gaza is approaching Operation Cast-Lead levels of deaths, and I think has maybe surpassed Cast-Lead for wounded already. Atrocities like the bombing of United Nations schools and the destruction of the lives of scores of people in them, provoking the normally comatose United Nations even to raise a whimper of protest. How can we talk about human rights when there's actually an extermination going on?
I think it's difficult to talk in a traditional human rights discourse when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, because it does go beyond that. It goes to the very heart of the Palestinian issue, which is the seemingly intent of Israel to remove Palestinians from the land that they've inhabited for millennia. I also think that when you know the situation is terrible, when like today you have the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, issuing an editorial questioning Israel's actions in Gaza, I think that it's got to that point now where everyone is questioning what's going on. What's happened in Gaza is shocking to the whole world. Not only UN facilities have been attacked, but a disabled charity. People have been killed. I was speaking.
Shifa Hospital. Hospitals have been regularly bombed and shot.
And I was speaking the other day to Hassan al-Halak. His family was bombed last week. He was the Gaza Scholar at Oxford Brookes last year. His house was bombed, his pregnant wife was killed, his 2 little boys, his mother and his sister. He has got first-degree burns over most of his body. I'm not sure that this can be in any way justified. It certainly doesn't fit into the terrorist narrative that Israel tells us, because Hassan was a bright young spark and is working at the Bank of Palestine and has been celebrated in the West academically, and his life is now torn apart. A ceasefire or an end to the occupation will not repair what's happened to that young man.
Can I get just one last quick answer from you? I'd like to tour this horizon with you all day. Egypt. We're now in a situation where Tony Blair and the Western governments are hailing the military junta of General Sisi. Yet human rights in Egypt are arguably, next to Gaza, the very worst of all.
That's certainly the case. I mean, an Egyptian monitoring group, Wiki Thrawa, say that there's been over 40,000 people jailed for political reasons since the military coup last year.
In what, a year and a half?
Yeah, well, just over a year.
Just over a year,
yeah. Hundreds sentenced to death. Whether this will be carried out or not, it isn't clear, but it doesn't really matter, because the idea is to spread fear amongst the population, not to question what's going on. And what we can see now with Gaza and Egypt is that Egypt are certainly part of an alliance with Israel. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of anger at the Egyptian ceasefire proposal, which many view as just being a Tony Blair initiative facilitated by the Israelis. And what's happened to Egypt is terrifying for the counter-revolutionary forces in the region, because they're trying to roll back the changes that we've seen since 2011.
Rory Donaghy, thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Joseph?
Well, on the point of Libya obviously being in chaos, Mr. Frog says, another example of Western arrogance, that they know best and their democracy brand must be accepted.
It is absurd, you know, to say that they've introduced democracy into Libya.
Certainly is.
The Prime Minister has been kidnapped, gunmen take over the parliament every other week, People have been assassinated, the US ambassador and so on. Shum democracy, shum mistake.
Terrible. And of course, on the human rights offences and the situation in Gaza, ICME says, will there be a stop to this? How can the world allow this? It's 1 month of brutal murders. And Martin Darraga says, Israel should be charged with committing war crimes. Well, that's all we've got time for this week, sir. But don't forget, you can contact us on Twitter. It's RT_Sputnik. And of course, follow us on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. But from me, Joseph Hayat, it's goodbye.
And from me, George Galloway, it's been marvellous.